I'm very honoured to have been asked to chair the panel on this subject, and I'm not going to go on too much because I really want to hear from the excellent speakers we have, and we have half an hour. So, first of all, I would like to ask and call on Michelle to speak to us today. And one of the things that I noted about your biography, extensive biography, was that you chair a panel of unmet need of lawyers. And if there's one thing in Ireland we know that we need, is the unmet need around the law, consent, people with disabilities, capacity, all of that to be met. And for those of us working in advocacy and those who have disabilities, we know that people have great difficulty in accessing law. So, but in terms of the subject of consent and sex, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, followed by Joe and Anna, and hand forward to you.
Great, thank you so much. This is an extraordinary honor to be here and to learn. I wanted to come to learn from all of you, and I'm very excited that any of my work is useful to this effort, this collective effort. I am a rape law scholar, and I want to talk a little bit about the work that I do in rape law and how it might apply around issues of consent to sex for the disability rights community. Rape traditionally, as perhaps you know, has been defined as, under English common law, penetration plus force plus non-consent. So the penetration historically was gendered. It was a vagina and a penis, and that was it. That has changed since then, but under English common law, it was a gendered notion of penetration. Force was, and still remains, very important in many laws, but there is a tremendous movement by feminists to abolish the requirement of force and to make rape, which has been successful in some parts of the United States, just about non-consensual penetration, whether or not physical force, additional physical force, is applied. I'm going to set aside the question of force, and I just want to talk about consent, because that's what's most important here. Traditionally, consent has been defined as the voluntarily yielding to the will of another. So someone else has an intention, it's a male intention to have sex, and the female yields to it. She willingly submits. This is about passivity, and it's insufficiently protective of many people, historically women. It's insufficiently protective of what I'll call sexual autonomy. That is the freedom from sexual abuse. And sex was seen historically as a male right, except under circumstances in which women were presumed not to be able to consent, could not consent under the law. And that included those who were children, minors, those who were unconscious, that is, they're asleep, those who were incapacitated, which under the law didn't have to do with mental disability. It had to do, in rape law, with being so drunk that you could not cognitively engage in consent. And then last, what was disparagingly called, someone was mentally defective. This was a mental disease or defect. We would call it a cognitive impairment, where they did not understand the nature of the conduct at issue, that is the sex at issue. Historically, under the common law, married women had to consent. There was a marital rape exemption, and you could not claim rape in a condition of marriage. Most women who were sexually active were presumed to consent, and certain women could not consent. Those who were unconscious, children, incapacitated, that is drunk, or mentally defective, which was how the law thought of it. The critique is, obviously, that this was insufficiently protective to most women and to most human beings, and yet paternalistically overprotective of other groups, those in particular with mental impairments. So the feminist community came forward to ask for a consent standard that respected sexual autonomy. And the disability rights community has now come forward and requested a uniform standard that respects sexual agency, that is, the ability to engage in sexual activity. I think the argument for a uniform standard is absolutely right. And what we need is a standard of consent that's a balance between protection on the one hand and freedom on the other. Actually, freedom is on both sides of the equation. Sexual autonomy is freedom from sex that you don't want. Sexual agency is freedom to engage in sex that you do want. So it's about desire on one hand and the protection of boundaries on the other. And I'm very interested in the way the norms are expressed by the law. In general, and how we think about bodies generally. If we think that bodies should be able to be penetrated at will, you would say, well, penetration is legitimate unless there's an objection, unless there's some resistance to it, some expression of non-consent. If bodies are not available, then there needs to be something to legitimate the moment of penetration, to say, well, this makes the penetration okay, and that moment is consent. So how do we define consent is what's at issue here. So I'm going to try to articulate to you what I think is most important in that moment of consent and how it applies in the disability rights context. I believe there's a great importance of desire and boundary. And rape law doesn't talk at all about those two things. It doesn't talk about desires, doesn't talk about sexual boundaries. Sexual education doesn't talk about desire. It doesn't really often even talk about sexual boundaries and the negotiation of sexual boundaries. It does something very different, at least in the United States, and I bet here in Ireland too, and most of the world, to the extent that it happens anywhere in the world. The project that Anna articulated earlier talks about this as the will and preferences. The way I think about it is desire and boundaries. So women generally, particularly sexually active women, are presumed to be available for penetration unless they express a boundary. And those with cognitive impairments are unable to enjoy sexual intercourse no matter the assertion of desire. So I think that the moment of consent should be about the negotiation of desires and boundaries. And instead of this traditional notion of consent that we have, there should be a moment where there is a communicative exchange of some kind in which there is an expression of desires and boundaries and a request for an agreement, a request for, does that sound good to you? This is some kind of conversation leading to some kind of agreement. It's not about a contract, it's not about offer and acceptance, or consideration. Would that were true, that there were consideration in sex. As we understand, that's a joke for the lawyers in the room. Actually, it's a joke for non-lawyers too, because consideration is applicable whether you're, right, it just means different things in the law of contract. Would that it were true, that consideration were central to the act of sex. But so the notion here would be a uniform standard, that consent would be negotiations of sexual penetration, whether or not there's a cognitive impairment. This isn't about an assessment of a cognitive impairment on either side. And it's about something I learned this morning. It's about the intent to engage in legal agency, whether or not there's a complicated and complete understanding of the consequences of that assertion of legal agency. Negotiation, in my mind, means a practice of dialogue. It's about the ethics of sex. It sounds more formal than it is. It's actually something that we do all the time when we engage in sexual penetration. Does this feel good? Is this something you want? The language that's much more explicit that we use when we engage in sexual intimacy. And that is an expression of desire and a request for a response. For married women, let me just go through the three different types that I laid out before. Married women, women who are sexually active, and people with cognitive impairments. For married women, historically, they must consent. And under the theory of negotiation, the question is simply, did the parties agree, did they negotiate and agree to this penetration, this act of penetration? Historically, for sexually active women, there's a question of an assumption of consent. Here, under a negotiated consent, it would be Did they negotiate this act of penetration? Whether or not she or he has a long history of sexual behavior, that's irrelevant. For those with cognitive impairments, the law assumes that they cannot consent. And under the negotiated theory of consent, it would be, did the parties agree to this act of sexual penetration? Note that the question is exactly the same, whether or not you're married or sexually active and unmarried, or you have a cognitive impairment, one way or the other. It's simply about the capacity to engage in some kind of communication that expresses desire and boundaries and come to an agreement about this. What I really was thrilled about is that I've been thinking about this from the perspective of rape law for a long time and writing about this, and then Anna and Eleanor come to me in New York and they say, we think this is a very interesting theory to get rid of that's applicable in the disability rights context. And it may have something important to say about what are the ethics of sexual behavior independent of the cognitive abilities of the parties. So, timer, perfectly done. Thanks, y'all.
Excellent timing. Our next speaker, and I have the pleasure of talking to Joe at lunchtime about care politics. Because for those of you who would be interested in watching the results tomorrow, Clare is known as a bellwether constituency. Not that we have many of them in Ireland, we just go, they're interesting places. But tomorrow they'll be very interesting, and Joe is going home to vote this evening. And can I remind all of you to vote today if you're on the register? Thank you. But Joe was chairperson, the first chairperson of the National Platform of Self-Advocates, and is still involved with the platform as a representative from Clare, and is involved and works as a consultant for the world as a charity in developing services in County Clare. And he's going to speak to us about the work that he has carried out, the representations he's made on the issue of sexual consent. Thanks very much, Joe.
Okay, the first time that I heard about the Sexual Offences Act of 1983 was when a group of people from the Brothers Charity in association with Rob Hopkins was going up to the Pat show to do a piece on it at that stage. And I came from the Rehabilitation Institute in Limerick. I left school in October or June 86. I started in rehab on the 14th of October 1986. I left that in the 16th of March 1990. I joined the Brothers on the 20th of March 1990. And during my lifetime as an advocate, the Brothers did try to set up several types of advocacy within the service. They did not rob. And basically, I left that then in 2001, and I worked for the Irish Seed Savers Association in Caparone in Scotland, County Clare. This is an organisation that preserves all varieties of seeds and apple trees. So therefore, I was one of the privileged ones that most of those people that I work with came from different backgrounds. France, Italy, some of them are from all parts of Spain. We have multicultural people are working over there, Rob, and you may or may not know some of them. But Rob was manager of a service in Kilrush for many years before he took up his present position as the Clare Inclusive Research Coordinator. And am I correct in that?
Right.
And
you might just say there, Joe, that actually as a result of your work at Seed Savers, we were going to Inclusion Island for a number of years, and you made a presentation in Prague of your work there and a film, and that film was picked up by Inclusion Europe and brought round the world.
Brussels, was it? No.
It was brought round the world as the initial discussions about setting that capacity, the Convention on the Rights of Disability. So you were in at the beginning of that story. You're living meaningful lives.
I was one along with Kathleen Ryan, if memory serves me correct. Was Martin Corrie part of that?
Yes.
Well, we were a part of 3 people that was included in that presentation to Brussels. But we never got any thanks from the powers that be in Brussels of any acknowledgement of that. Only through what you knew at the time.
That's right.
Am I correct in that, or is that?
You're right. No, you're right. You're right.
So, to get on to the present topic, what we're talking about now, the Sexual Offences Act, Rob was going up to Dublin, as I said, to the Kilkenny show, and the first thing hearing me said, did I know anything about the Sexual Offences Act of 1983? I was only 3 years in the Brothers at that. I had left Brothers at that stage, but I was 3 years within in the organisation when I didn't even know any of that existed.
And it was not being explained to anybody at the time. Nobody knew. It was like a dark secret that nobody actually spoke about.
Basically, what the brothers were doing, they were organising Ben's Christmas parties, and we were making friends with people we worked with. In my own case, I brought tickets for a number of 1 or 2 individuals who will remain nameless because they're no longer in the service, one in particular, but I'm not going to mention any names without their consent, and I can't. But the big thing about that kind of thing, if we're trying for work, and my image is out there to promote Brussels and promote good practice with the Brothers Society, or with whatever organisation I happen to be involved with, whether it is in the platform of self-advocates or not. The thing is, we are the people that need to be consulted if we are given accurate information to the powers that be. It's no good in we going to hospital and our parents having us, in my own case, born in '68, and then we're not part of the family. So therefore, if we're part of the family, and even though we're born with minor defects or whatever defect we're born with, we as people have to live with that. So therefore, my thing with that is I've done an awful lot with you, and remember I didn't know you. You weren't in the Clare service, you weren't in the Killrow service at the time, were you not?
That's right.
So therefore, you were a fresh pair of, I won't say, you were a fresh face within the organisation. But to say that people like me or people out on the floor or people like yourself break laws every day, and yet you can get off, you can find ways around, we'll say, loopholes. But we can't, unless we understand the law.
Your point there was that we ended up working with Kelly Johnson on an inclusive research paper that became a book from different places around the world of people, relationships and sexuality, standing in my shoes. I'm afraid we haven't got it projected up there for people to look for that. Standing in my shoes, relationships and sexuality with people with learning disability. You had said, I may have broken the law many times, but you hadn't been given the information. This was your point about the consent, and you weren't told about this legislation about consent, but you went to the Law Reform Commission and...
Myself and Gemino and yourself went up to the Law Reform Commission. We met Miss Clark, whatever her first name is.
Ricardo Clark, yes.
And we sat down and had a good talk with her. Now, the legislation is gone so far, and as far as I know, it has been discussed in the Dáil, but I'm not sure if there's any action has been taken on it so far. So
I think it's stalled now. I was talking to Ellen there. She was saying it's stalled at the moment. It's stalled at the moment.
So basically, my argument is, if the people in the powers that be, including lawyers, that act for the government, they need to understand, or else come and live in our shoes and see if we took control of, if I took the keys off of everybody here that knew how to drive and said, here, get home from here yourself and manage in your own shoes. I have the story that a man told me he lost his sight and he couldn't accept the fact that he lost his sight because he was so used to driving. So when I'm told stories like that in confidence, there is an awful lot of wrong information given to people who may come into the service. now things have changed for the better, I hope. But if the government or governments of the Irish state, England, America, if they don't have one common practice from Brussels, or we don't have proper legislation within our own country, why are we being promoted as the world's best practice if we're fed the wrong information?
Yeah.
Because if the organisations who are providing services for us are supposed to be, can't provide that information, they should say, put us in touch with people that know what they're talking about.
I suppose you were talking about just peeling back the layers. That people were not given any information at all. Staff were certainly told, families had a vague idea, but staff were certainly told and knew that there were laws preventing people with learning disabilities having intimate relationships. And it's only when you guys got on the bandwagon and started creating ructions about it.
I had to laugh.
It's not the only reason, but it became a prominent
I had to laugh when you said
topic.
this before.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
2 minutes left.
So, in relation to the Sexual Offences Act, it needs to be repealed or changed, and there's need to have practical legislation for people with disabilities. Now, whether we have a two-tier system in Ireland where you need extra time for those who are not as good to communicate for themselves as those who can, that's probably the way to go. But don't discriminate against anybody that has a different way of learning, because it was never done in school, so why should it be done in the real world? If you pardon my French. So my conclusion is that the President of Ireland or the President of America or whoever is in power needs to have simple language that people like me can understand, or people who can't even read or write can understand as well. And if people like you and Inclusive Research have the knowledge, or Inclusion Ireland or the platform, we need to be promoting the practical information for practical things. Thank you.
Now going to call on Anna from the project's perspective to respond and maybe talk a bit about how the project is going to look at these issues.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, and I might just give a little bit of a background because Eleanor and I in particular have come to this issue actually after quite a few years of work in the area in Ireland on issues that Joe has already talked about a little bit. So as you've probably gathered from Joe's talk, and also from the talk earlier on the Somebody to Love documentary, there is a law that currently exists in Ireland that makes it a criminal offence, essentially, for a person with a cognitive disability to have sex. Unless they're married, then it's fine. So that's kind of going back to the antiquated laws that Michelle was talking about earlier, and also has a weird tie-in with choice and what choice means and when we're allowed to make choices. So we knew about that law, and then were particularly moved by both the documentary Somebody to Love and also a really wonderful play that was put on in Galway by the Blue Teapot Theatre Company called Sanctuary, which is a theatre company of individuals with intellectual disability, and the play is all about relationships in Ireland and what barriers exist, including this law. We knew about all these things and how they already tied into the work we were doing on legal capacity, and we're particularly excited when Senator Catherine Zappone contacted us and said she wanted to put a bill forward to change this law, and would we help her draft it? And we did. So we went through a process which included consultation with the national platform. I believe you were involved.
That's right. Catherine Sapone came to one meeting that when I was chairperson of the platform at the time, and she said she would help us change the law or do some work with us. So therefore, if she gets back in again, or if she's still in the Senate, the people in Dáil need to go back and look at legislation that's drafted but not implemented.
Yeah, so that's exactly what Catherine did, and we helped her, and we put together a law which was quite radical, to be quite frank. We decided to go as far as we could with this law, and we wanted to do more than just get rid of the bad law. We wanted to find out what we could do that would change sexual offences law as a whole to solve some of the problems, particularly that people with disabilities face in this area. So one of them being, of course, we want to provide a sexual offences legislation that protects everyone, right? That's what it's for. And we also want to, as Michelle was talking about, make sure that in that legislation that's providing protection, we still recognize the sexual autonomy of everyone, and that everyone has a choice and has the freedom to choose to take part in intimacy and sexual activities when they want to. And the Irish law is currently not doing that, and what we tried to do in the bill was to open up space for that. Parts of that bill were incorporated into another bill that was put forward by the Department of Justice, and I believe that's what Rob was mentioning and Joe was mentioning, is stalled in the Dáil right now. But the way in which that's relevant to this project is we want to take all those ideas and the knowledge that we have and the experience that we have and that others have on how this type of law is affecting people with disabilities and what Article 12 and the right to legal capacity can do to fix that. We want to take all those concepts and try to come up with some comprehensive solutions. So the work that we've done thus far has been, we've come up with a few sort of conclusions or proposals at least for things that need to change. The first one, which again Michelle touched on, is that the capacity to consent construct, we believe, is actually probably not one that's needed. It's applied definitely in Ireland, but also in the UK we've seen this, disproportionately to people with disabilities, and that's when it doesn't explicitly only apply to people with disabilities, as the law here in Ireland would. So we think that what we should be able to have is a law on consent, if we stick within the consent paradigm, but for now assuming that we do, that encompasses the problems that we're trying to avoid with capacity legislation. So if we're assuming that our hearts are all in the right place, what capacity consent to sex legislation should be avoiding is sex that occurs when one party doesn't understand what's happening. So, of course we don't want that to happen. And that should be illegal, it should be a criminal offense. But we believe that that can be done within consent law, and that there should be a comprehensive definition of consent that includes that. And what we proposed in the bill that we wrote with Catherine Sapone, and in some of the articles we've written, is that consent include understanding, agreement, and negotiation to reach that agreement. And we drew on Michelle's work to inform that definition. And that should apply to everyone. That's not something that's specific to people with disabilities. If someone doesn't understand the sexual act that they're engaging in and hasn't agreed to it, there's no way that whatever happens there should be considered consensual. So we believe that a construction of consent like that would provide better protection for everyone. So this is the type of thing that we're planning to build on throughout this project, hopefully. We're really looking forward to getting more personal experiences from organizations like the National Platform and individuals that are interested in sharing those stories to help us construct a law that does encompass all of these issues and provides both protection from abuse and the freedom to choose when and with whom you're having intimate relationships.
I've got to say that all of us who are on the national platform come from all over the country.
Yeah.
We have representatives in Galway, Dublin, Kilkenny, as far away as up towards the north
Yeah.
of Ireland. So we have one representative from each almost 32 countries except for Donegal.
Yeah, and so the consultation process we did in writing the bill with Catherine Zappone was wonderful because we got stories from all around Ireland, and we're hoping to get a similar response and have an even more in-depth experience in this project.
That's very good, Jen. Thank you.